Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our final wrap-up session. We have had a really packed program, as many of you who've been with us for the entire time have seen. So I really would like to get right into it, because while we've had quite a bit of time for discussion throughout the 3 days, this is really the space where we can take stock and discuss what you'd like to see going forward. You'll see, of course, on the screen it says action plan. That feels quite strong, like a strong word, but really it's the purpose here is to pull out those key points for advocacy, policy, and reform that have stuck with you. And that's really the overarching objective of this session. I believe that we have in the room representation from every single panel, which is great. And so we really want to bring all these key points together. I am not going to do a wrap up of the panels that we've seen today, because I feel as though they're quite fresh in our minds, and I will let those of you in the room who attended or spoke on those sessions talk directly about the key points and your views. So just 2 questions I'd like you to keep in mind through this session is, first, what would you like to see as next steps? We have, of course, the policy notes that many of you have submitted, and of course, all the feedback now that you've received and we've received over the course of the 3 days. But how best can we advance all of the recommendations that we've discussed? And how can we move this conversation forward into action, which has been a recurring theme also throughout the workshop. And while I recognize that that's a broad question, so my second then question is a bit more focused, and that's, depending on what organization or stakeholder group you represent, or where you work in the field of mixed movement, what are the 1 or 2 key takeaways? It can be more, of course, if you have, for you, something that you want to take forward in your work. And it can be from your panels, or it can be from one that you attended. And so those would be the 2. I will go ahead and I'll pop those questions in the chat so that you can also see them written down. But for now, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Eddie O'Dwyer from UNHCR, to start off with some broad reflections on what we have, on what we've learned so far. Over to you, Eddie. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayla. So I'll be very summary if I can. I'll just try and hop between the various topics. On trafficking in human beings, we opened with that, trafficking in human beings. And I suppose just starting from UNHCR point of view, we just launched, the Vincent's office has just launched this Central Mediterranean appeal. And this section here, this forum here will help that appeal to update itself as it moves forward, especially on the trafficking side. So that was the first thing. A message comes out: nobody is in favor of dangerous journeys. There is a geographical aspect to this. We know where these geographical areas are, so there must be some attention to the geography. There is this idea of a rapid response mechanism. Certainly not one small office that we know well, but it needs to be in a bigger forum going out there, and maybe some reflections around that would be good. Noted that the people on the move are about 15% of displaced people. They form ghost populations. There are links to trafficking. There are links to smuggling. There are links to terrorism. There are links to criminality more broadly, and this is problematic for governments as for everybody else. And then you have all of these structures like the continental, the Africa Pole, Europol, the Continental Center in Khartoum, and how are all these things going to work together to operationalize a response? Quick response, longer term. So I think that's these are some of the reflections from trafficking. I won't go too far into smuggling, but to say that there was if you follow the various points that were made, there's a nuance necessary in our attitudes and understanding of this phenomenon. Going back to the time when in 1,000 years ago, these routes were being used to help people to move, from West Africa to Mecca to, on the caravans, etc., etc. But, and over time, the point was made that these routes have been taken over by criminal enterprises. And when borders put themselves in the way of these natural organic routes. So, the person who builds a boat in Tunisia is building a boat, and then he's doing some income generation by responding to an audience. So yes, there has to be, is it going to be criminalized? Is it not going to be criminalized? Smuggling, of course, there needs to criminalize criminal activity, but there needs to be a holistic approach on smuggling, and to understand that better and how to move that forward. Other topics we were talking about disclosure. Let me go to another one. Trust came out as a huge issue. Trust of migrants, trust of refugees in authorities. Trust, in fact, of some organizations in authorities. Trust of the authorities and organizations. Right now, we understand that migrants and refugees don't trust authorities or police. And if that's the case, then how are you going to resolve the issue of state-led solutions and continent to continent and regional solutions if there's no trust in the people who are leading these policies? So and then our NGOs or international organizations going to fill that gap. Obviously, they have a role to play, but again, there's certainly more reflection on the trust side of things to come to be advanced, to understand that better. In terms of disclosure, there were some really good points that came up about disclosure and getting down to understand what the real stories of people are, because there are real people and real stories. So the Guichet unique approach, innovations with media approaches, and training and more training. So that was another one that came out. Some very interesting ones on cities, how cities can become partners in this whole thing, not legally, and engaged in the programmatic responses. We do understand there are NGOs and lots of players in the urban context already, but that's not necessarily capacitating the urban authorities to do their work or to accompany the process. So the idea is, how are those authorities and cities going to be accompanied to get into that framework? The regional considerations. Let's look at the holistic thing as well. Going out to the analysis of migration events, such as that in Saudi Arabia or in Israel, getting more strict migration policies, and how the conflict in South Sudan or indeed Libya affects the arrivals in Sudan, and is Sudan going to become a destination country in the future? I will leave it there. I think we know that hopefully COVID will move out of our lives soon, but of course the recovery and the response to COVID on inclusion and that whole message that came out. Inclusion is a winner, exclusion is not a winner on all indicators. So that was key. I think we're going to hear a lot more about the Libya European debate. I'm not going to go in there. That's a hot one. We've heard wonderful presentations by the EU and AU. I think we need to join up those two discussions that we heard, one this morning, one yesterday. Tremendous. How are they going to link together? I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. Can I invite anyone who would like to intervene here to please raise your hand, or if you prefer, pop your question in the chat box. And in fact, I can already, I know we have at least one of the rapporteurs in the room from panel 4, Janina. May I call you out first to give us some thoughts?
Of course, I would love to. Let me just check my notes. I wasn't prepared to be the first one, but I'm happy to. Yeah, so focusing on the main points, on the policy implications and recommendations that came out of our panel. I will go a little bit by talk to have some structure in there. We heard from Georgia, who really drew our attention to the fact that sometimes assuming direct causal relations between a situation in country of origin and rising arrivals in countries of destination can lead to policy responses that actually overlook important dynamics elsewhere that might contribute to these mixed movements. And so one of the recommendations that came out of this was that regional policy dialogues like the Khartoum process should really look beyond policy regions to capture intra and interregional movement patterns and dynamics. And Georgia gave us the platform between Asian and Gulf states discussing mixed movements and protection of migrant workers as an example that that we could use. Then we had two very interesting presentations by Amira and by Nick and Kudakwashe, I'm so sorry, and Professor Joe. They were focusing on how COVID-19 is changing not so much the policies, the migration policies we see in the Mediterranean, but the way they're implemented. And Amira summed it up really well by asking, is the pandemic used to deter migration? Both presentations showed that state responses to COVID-19 were not really migration sensitive, but that the health procedures, especially by EU member states, actually contributed to making migration more difficult for migrants and for refugees, and in some cases risked violating international obligations of states to protect migrants and refugees. So the policy recommendations that came out here was really to use advocacy to make the point vis-a-vis national governments not to use the pandemic as an excuse for strengthening securitization, but to ensure that crisis management upholds fundamental rights of migrants and refugees. And then the final presentation, I had the great pleasure to give it together with Lionel. And this was about the role of cities. And we tried to make the point that cities should be a lot more included in policymaking when it comes to developing local and national and international protection frameworks. So we think it would be interesting to think about if there's a role for local authorities in the Rabat process, in the Khartoum process. And it would also be interesting to have more direct cooperation between international humanitarian and development actors and cities when it comes to developing strategies to address urban migration and displacement and implementing the global compacts. And we had a very good question asking, well, humanitarian actors are already working with so many actors, how can we manage that? And we think that here it would be an idea to start with working with city networks that unite cities that are interested in engaging on questions of migration displacement. And and the last point that Leonard, that was very important to him, was that there's a local charter of African local and regional authorities on migration, where they really pledged to uphold rights of migrants and refugees, and that cities, but also UNHCR and civil society could make this charter a lot more visible and use it to engage local authorities in developing local protection frameworks. So far from my side, questions very welcome.
Thanks so much, Janina. In fact, we have a comment that's just been raised by Rua. Would you like to unmute and say it out loud, or would you prefer I read it out?
Thanks, Ayla. Yes, for the comment, I just wanted to say that there was a very important point that was raised the first day and also was raised also yesterday and today. It is the importance of capacitating the local authorities and also local NGOs, because after all, these are the ones remaining in the areas that international organizations do not have access to, so that they can identify victims of trafficking and also provide basic protection services to these victims of trafficking. Nothing else to add to that point. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that. It seems to be this key theme that's gone throughout all of the panels, as you rightly point out, of local authorities being a key ally, something that Belen said yesterday, but that we've seen come across in many different ways, whether it's using them as key actors in raising awareness, for trust building, as an important part of identification. And so it's really key to take on board, as well as their capacity to potentially provide protection and connect to these more national and regional or international processes. Can I invite anyone else to come in and give thoughts from any of the other panels, or perhaps if they want to follow up on any of the points just raised now? Please go ahead, Jim.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to follow up quickly on the city's perspective as well before we move on. Yeah, something I found particularly interesting in your paper, Janina, and also during the presentation, is that although I guess we do now realize that cities are really key allies, that often they perform activities or engage in activities that fall really outside their jurisdiction and almost border something illegal that is actually, yeah, not permitted within like the frameworks that exist. So how do we advocate? How do we ensure that the national authorities really see this importance? So kind of like taking it to the next level, how do we ensure that the national authorities are aware of this movement, and how do we advocate for them seeing this as the next big step that has to be taken in terms of migration governance? Over.
Thank you really very much for that. Anyone else, really feel free to unmic and just go ahead. Let's go with Georgia, and then I'm not sure if it's new hands or old hands, but Janina and Jim.
Thanks, Ayla. It's been a really, really interesting couple of days. So thank you very much to all the organisers. I think one of the things that stood out for me is that there's been a lot of discussion about needing more of particular things than needing, to enhance partnerships and to have more collaboration between various entities to ensure that there are the right channels of dialogue and people are talking, and more training and things like this. Maybe what I'm just wondering is, given there are going to be limitations around capacity for all the organizations that are involved, presumably something's going to have to give, or there are existing practices which have just been found repeatedly not to work, and small changes in how they operate isn't necessarily going to be sufficient in order to create change at the pace that a lot of these presentations have been so compelling around. We need to be addressing these things now. So one of the things that stands out is, what are those policies that really don't work? What are those practices that we can really think about moving away from in order to raise space for some of the more innovative approaches, or even to raise space for more of the discussions and collaborations that people have flagged over the last couple of days?
Thanks so much for that, Georgia. I think that's a really important point, and it's the counterfactual to this. And maybe we'll have a part 2 workshop where we can we can dedicate it to discussing what doesn't work, but stay tuned for that. Janina, I'm just going to skip you for a quick second to go to Nahum, who's just raised his hand. Nahum, can you turn your video on and unmute? Thank you.
Okay. Hello again, and thank you for granting me this opportunity. There is one point that I think is important, and it is like I assume there are plenty of humanitarian organizations. However, they are there, despite their existence, they are hardly known by migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. And it's very important if these NGOs can arrange some means of introducing themselves to those people, to those migrants, asylum seekers, or refugees, because it's usually easier for the NGOs to trace the migrants who are in Tunisian territory than the migrants to trace the NGOs. And as a result, those migrants might be able to identify any kind of assistance they can benefit from those NGOs. For instance, when we first came and sought asylum, we never heard of an association called of an institution called IADH, which is Arab Institute for Human Rights, for quite long, though they were the ones we had to approach to ask about any legal claims and rights we might have wanted. And even now, I believe there are many who are in need of their assistance and who still don't know such an institute does exist. I would like to highlight my point is not exclusively about IADH, but rather about humanitarian organizations that we are unaware of their existence, though we can actually benefit from their services. That's my point. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Janina, would you then come in, and then after Hassan?
Thank you, Ayla. I was just thinking when Jim raised the question of the role of national governments, that's actually, if you look into city diplomacy, is one of the really critical and difficult points, and one where some cities very openly criticize the national governments, which might be important in some cases, but doesn't help so much in convincing the national governments that they should transfer more scope of action to cities. While there's also this really strong narrative that cities and city networks push at the international level, where they're trying to say, well, we don't want to replace governments, obviously national governments, but we really believe that we are part of the multi-level governance approach, and that we should be. And I think here it might be an interesting approach to work with governments that are actually supportive of this kind of city engagement when it comes to migration governance. And there's not a lot of them right now, but for example, there's the government of Switzerland who's very vocal about it and who might be a good actor to start engagement in this direction.
Thank you, Janina. On this point of cities, there's a comment from Vincent in the chat about the need to amplify the essential role that local authorities play in keeping or maintaining, promoting social cohesion, their capacity gaps, and we have to advocate for more direct funding and support to go through them through ministries. And to comment on this further, it's cities and it's local communities where refugees and migrants, or with whom refugees and migrants engage. They don't necessarily engage with national actors, and so they represent both themselves, but they also represent the society at large and its structures. So it's essential because they are fulfilling all these different functions that we don't immediately recognize that they do. Hassan, please, the floor is yours. You are muted, Hassan, maybe. Okay, well, Hassan Boubakri sorts out the technical issues. Can I invite any other panelists to chip in on this?
Yes.
Oh, here you are. Great. Please.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Ayla. Moi, juste, je vais parler en français pour aller rapidement. Il me semble qu'il faudrait peut-être voir comment renforcer tous les cadres de coordination et de médiation. Il me semble que c'est très important. Nous pouvons parler beaucoup de programmes, d'actions, de plaidoyer, mais il faudrait travailler aussi sur les cadres de médiation. Quand je dis médiation, je vois par exemple au niveau des pays, quand les autorités locales interviennent, parfois les autorités centrales ne répondent pas aux attentes ou considèrent que les pouvoirs locaux ou les autorités locales dépassent leur rôle en voulant s'emparer en quelque sorte, entre guillemets, de la question de la protection. Ils considèrent que c'est une question donc plutôt qui relève des autorités centrales. Donc, il peut y avoir, on a vu ça et là, des conflits de compétences ou de pouvoir entre les différentes sphères des intervenants ou des acteurs qui interviennent dans la production ou qui veulent apporter dans la protection ou qui veulent apporter la protection. L'autre élément, c'est au niveau transrégional. Déjà, si on prend l'Afrique du Nord, qui est l'un des pays qui est au centre de notre problématique, il n'y a pas déjà de coopération horizontale entre les États. Et ce qui fait que, en fait, chaque pays ou chaque groupe d'acteurs dans chaque pays, en quelque sorte, travaille tout seul sans consultation avec les autres acteurs dans les autres pays. Déjà, ça, c'est un lac, c'est une grande lacune, c'est une grande faiblesse qui ne peut qu'affaiblir, je veux dire, les efforts et les programmes de protection ou d'assistance ou d'anticiper les besoins. L'autre, c'est au niveau aussi trans-Sahara, si je veux dire. Je veux dire, l'Union africaine travaille beaucoup au niveau du continent, mais il semble qu'il faudrait peut-être que l'Union africaine, la Commission, mette en place des tuyaux ou des mécanismes de coopération entre déjà, par exemple, si je prends le cas, entre l'Afrique du Nord et les pays du Sahel, pratiquement de la Corne de l'Afrique jusqu'à le Golfe de Guinée, les pays du Golfe de Guinée et de l'ECOWAS, de la Communauté des États d'Afrique de l'Ouest. Il me semble qu'il faudrait mettre en place, je veux dire, cet outil qui permettrait la coopération et la coordination des efforts en même temps des États, des organisations internationales et des organisations de la société civile. Il y a trois acteurs fondamentaux qu'il faut mettre sous cet outil transrégional, trans-Sahara, parce que c'est là où se posent les problèmes les plus délicats et où on voit que les lacunes sont très fortes. Donc, moi, j'appelle à une médiation, un outil de coordination au niveau des États, des pays, entre les différents intervenants pour qu'il n'y ait pas de conflit de pouvoir et de conflit de compétences. Un, deux, qu'il y ait une coopération trans-Sahara, appelons-la comme ça, pour que, je veux dire, peut-être 80% ou les trois quarts des difficultés et des faiblesses et des besoins s'expriment dans cet espace large entre les pays du Sahel, comme j'ai dit, et l'Afrique du Nord. Merci.
Thank you very much, Hassan. And just to echo some comment from Vincent in the chat, that this point that you raise about also needing to recognize this horizontal or intracontinental cooperation is key, and one that I think we haven't highlighted so strongly during these discussions. So thank you for directing our attention at it. If we could turn now to Fergus, who has a similar point to one raised just before, albeit in the context of Libya. Please, Fergus, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ayla. Yeah, I was just thinking as Yanina was talking about the parallels between, I think what we agree is the need to work more with local authorities, and what came up in the discussion about Libya earlier, and the fact that it's not necessarily the national policymakers who are influencing what happens in detention centers and, you know, whether people were being released during the pandemic. And so it seemed to me like a related point that we need to more generally not just think about influencing national policymakers as the route to achieving change, that actually kind of building trust and relationships with people who are closer to the refugees and migrants on the ground is actually often going to be more impactful. I think that's already what people who are sort of working in programming in the field are doing, but it should also be part of our reflection on policy influencing, I think. So yeah, whether that's local authorities or refugee-led groups and the communities of concern on the ground there, that just having those local direct influences can be much more important than just looking to the national policy or legal frameworks, which might not necessarily translate through as well as you would hope when you're making that advocacy. So just thinking about those different routes to achieving change in Trump, I thought that would be something to highlight in our strategy for, you know, how we want to think about these policy recommendations.
Thank you very much, Fergus. Can I invite anyone from the panels on the first day to oh yes, Megan, we were thinking along the same lines. Please, the floor is yours.
Good, I read your mind. I hope you don't mind. I'm not using video because my connection is a bit dodgier as I'm speaking to you all from Cox's Bazar. But just building on what Edward has mentioned earlier and in the overarching questions and the action plan and what Fergus has just mentioned, I think it's really key for us to think about how can we better adapt our programming and adapt to the ever-evolving needs of victims of trafficking or migrants or communities at heightened risk in what's a rapidly changing global mobility landscape when I'm looking at this map and thinking about all the new shocks and stresses involved in that. Our attitudes are really key in all of this, and just thinking about reinvigorating the counter-trafficking field and really adapting it to the needs of those at risk. I think it's key for us to be self-reflexive as practitioners. That's where it starts, to think carefully about the program design. I feel this was echoed in our own presentation with my co-panelist Sarah, but also in Dalmar Hamid's presentation in negotiating vulnerabilities and protection gaps, that we really need to try to not over-narrate the stories of migrants and victims of trafficking, and allowing more space for the agency of those affected to come into play, and at the policy table as well, and in program design. How can we really have that space to cultivate innovative thinking? How do we provide the space for that? And thinking about all these many complex family, kinship networks and ties involved in trafficking and smuggling. And when we're talking about this holistic approach, what does that look like in practice? I think looking at refugee-led initiatives like Fergus has just mentioned is really key, and thinking about how can we bridge for more active participation in policy and program design. And I think if we start to think about how we can make those partnerships more meaningful, and for us to be critical and self-reflexive as practitioners and build trust and relationships and what have you, that's going to help build that holistic framework we keep referring to. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Based on that point about being more adaptable and flexible and thinking about how that can steer the partnerships that we engage in, could I put Leander on the spot? Because I think your interventions was one of the few that promoted a new model rather than presented us with some of the challenges that existed. So could I ask you, Leander, to unmic to speak a little bit to this point of partnerships and not waiting until there's a crisis to respond?
Right. So thank you very much, Ayla, for the opportunity to come in again. Yeah, so I see the benefit in what I regarded as the whole of society approach, where the partnerships are built well ahead of a crisis situation taking place. And I think that that ties in with the element of trust as well, because for those partnerships to be meaningful, what we discussed yesterday about all partners being taken seriously and then functioning as co-equals is critical. And the role of NGOs and CSOs, civil society organizations, and also the private sector will need to be enhanced and then better recognized, because they have access to certain assets that the states or the big players might not have. If for nothing else, they are more in touch with the local community, and there is some element of intelligence and then support that they can provide to potential or people who are at risk of being trafficked, people who are vulnerable as in refugees or unaccompanied minors, and so on and so forth. So the joint up approach, teamwork, stakeholder, multi-stakeholder approach is one that needs to be given a lot of attention. And I think that there's a lot of merit in going in that direction as we think of the big solutions. We should think, we think big, but then we also need to think small in our effort to come up with concrete solutions to the burning issues of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leander. This was also a point raised on day one of not spreading ourselves too thin, but focusing on these small, once again, more holistic projects, but around in key spaces or in key areas that we can then give full attention to. Can I ask anyone else from the floor to chip in at this point, maybe from the second day or from our smuggling panel on the first day?
Sure. Hi, Ayla. Thanks. I seeing that no one else is stepping in. Let me just add 2 small cents to the table from the second day. Just to let folks know, we didn't have enough time in our presentation to go into much detail about it, but because our research on the area was focused on this idea of disclosure and how that's the more survivor or refugee or migrant side experience of coming forward and expressing the need for international protection in the first place. I just wanted to give a heads up that we did also, in addition to conducting the research that we presented a little bit, produce 2 tools that hopefully will be useful in the region as a sort of a practical guide or practice aids. One is a training module on disclosure that it has about 5 or 6 different components looking at disclosure in different scenarios, different aspects of it, including how disclosure might intersect or be complicated when we're dealing with survivors of trauma, for example, or those with very high security risks. There were also little parts of the training module that focus on clarifying asylum eligibility criteria, processes, just so that the service providers themselves, for example, have more clarity and have a better sense of what they're looking for and what people are entitled to. So we're developing that training module. It's being sort of finalized and polished right now, but we hope to make that available, or UNHCR, I think, will roll that out. And then the other tool that we designed, and I don't know if my colleague Julia wants to step in here because she really led on this. Julia, are you on? Did you want to just mention very briefly our other tool that might be useful to folks?
Sure, yeah, I can chime in. This second tool was also at the request of our UNHCR colleagues to develop a beta version. It's in beta version right now of a protection network map that currently is focused on the North Africa region, but has a potential, I think, to extend to other countries in the region, perhaps speaking to what some colleagues were saying earlier about trying to build connections more cross-continentally, for example. So the map idea is to be able to indicate where safe organizations, including community-based organizations and community-led organizations that are operating in different parts of the region. And the map would allow for those organizations to indicate what types of services they offer or information they offer, what populations they're serving primarily, and how to get in contact with them or learn more. So we hope that this can be the start of a tool that would help build those cross-regional bridges and help people learn more about the different, connect with each other, the different actors on the ground, and share, be able to refer perhaps up the road or know who somebody might have been coming from once they arrive at their door. So I don't know if, I know my colleague Belen is on the line, perhaps if she wanted to add something about the plans for that, I could pass it to you, Belen. So we, as I mentioned, still in beta form. Belen, are you there?
I am here. I don't know whether you can hear me.
We can hear you very well.
Okay, because yeah, I don't know if you can see me, but I just click on the buttons. Everything should be okay. So yeah, I mean the plans for this project is to expand further. The idea is to continue identifying and contacting and reaching out to more protection networks across the different routes. For us, particularly in the MENA region, of course. And the idea is to have this focus on the front line and the community-based organizations, but also, as we've been discussing, I think already, looking at other actors and how the interaction among all of them can bring the positive results. And look at also the different roles and the different responsibilities in terms of the functionalities and the capacities of each of us, looking at the different type of services, but also the different type of advocacy and influential situation that we can all together have. So in addition to that, the plan is also to not only to look at the map in itself, but also to make of the map a tool that helps this knowledge base of the different services, and possibly also to use it for further action in terms of communication with communities. So in principle, this map and the activities has focused a lot on the protection networks, on those who are there providing services, but the idea is to make sure that it is also used as and serve as a base for communication with communities. The training tool that was mentioned by Kim, of course, the plans together with the protection network to implement it, to monitor the impact, to make modifications, as well as to look at other other type of tools that may be useful for the different colleagues and partners engaged in the initiative. And one of them that was also I think mentioned by some of the colleagues is to use it as part of protection monitoring and also evidence-based for further advocacy with targeted audience, including when looking for allies at the interinstitutional bodies or state authorities. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Belen. Eddie, and then Anna Maria, please.
Okay, thanks, Ayla. So just to complement that particular point with the discussion that took place on day 2, and it was around the legal frameworks. And somebody, I think, made the point very eloquently that the role of history and politics in shaping the national situations, those situations who do not have legal frameworks for asylum or for migration management, that needs to I mean, I put down here that we need to get to the bottom of that. What is that impediment? So, I'm sure that there's a knowledge of that out there, but the point was made that it does need more reflection and more or possibly research and to put on the table to understand that better. It would involve civil initiatives and the inclusion of the various stakeholders. To the second point on that same point is that, you know, the discussion on refugee and migration law efforts with civil, it needs to involve the civil society. And if you remember the discussion yesterday with the director from the African Union, Madame, she said that, you know, she was very clear that, you know, in developing the AU relations, and, you know, she as a jurist was saying that, you know, when we develop relationships, whether it's between member states or internationally and partnerships in particular, then there has to be a legal framework. So it was very eloquently put, and it does flow into that, you know, European neighborhood discussion, the neighborhood discussion that came out there. To complement that, the point was made that if you don't have legal frameworks, you are leaving people behind. That was clearly, if you don't have legislation, you risk leaving people behind. So that was clearly stated as well. And finally, that there is a gap between the existing laws that are there, such as they are, and the practice. So there are laws in many countries, but they're not being implemented. So again, they're just to put the legal aspects of the frameworks back on the, you know, in that chart I'm looking at as an important element in our discussions. Over.
Definitely, and this ties actually quite well into what I was actually going to mention next. So drawing a little bit on these points that Julia, Kim, and Belen made on service mapping and knowing where services are available and community-based mapping, and also touching a little bit on what Nahom mentioned earlier about limited knowledge about knowing where to go when arriving in Tunisia. One of the things that we have here already on the page is trust, but something that I'm quite interested is also linking this trust and how responsibility plays a role in that trust as well. And I think that that's one thing that legal frameworks and implementation, as Eddie just mentioned, do. They link trust with responsibility. And I'd be quite curious to also hear a little bit more from some of the panelists today on this linking of trust and responsibility, particularly in Libya, which is quite complicated, and also on the Mediterranean, where we have the absence of states.
Someone unmiking? Is it a desire to come back in, Eddie, or an old hand? Okay, thank you for your point, Anna Maria.
Old hand.
Old hand, okay. I am conscious of the time and that we're approaching 15 minutes left, and I think already we've put together quite a great synthesis of some of the key takeaways thus far from the whole of the workshop. What we haven't discussed, and I know it's probably because it's a more difficult question, is what does this mean for our next steps? What would you like to see happen following the workshop? We have brought all of this knowledge together, and I would really like to hear from people in the room of what they would like to see come out of it. Because of course we're not here. A lot of us know the challenges that we've been sharing. I think what has been unique is the opportunity to bring a lot of these different perspectives together and to raise some of these recommendations, which I think are quite novel. But how do we make that next step? So does anyone have anything that they would like to suggest in terms of what they would like to see as part of the dissemination strategy that we have following this workshop, and what we do with the notes and all of the knowledge generated, and of course that we would then put to all of you for your consent to go forward with that. But does anyone have any ideas? Over. Please, Marcia.
Thank you very much, Ayla. Well, first of all, thank you, and thank you all and the organizers and panelists. It's been really interesting. I wasn't able to follow the entire event, but certainly the panels that I followed were very rich. And this discussion, I think, is, perfect testimony to the richness of the discussions held in the panels. So thank you very much for having me part of this. I wanted to come back to a point that came up during the panel on advocacy and the role of the media today, and also in connection with a point that was made on the first day. I think it was in the keynote by Vincent Cochetel on the, how sort of frameworks do exist for policy reform to happen, but it's most often a matter of lack of political will, right? And I hope that this was not too abstract and not too, I'm trying to make sense of all these different points as well as I go along. But I think, linking to how we influence political will to make policy changes, particularly not only programming, but really big policy changes on the Central Mediterranean route, Western, and on the routes to the Sahel, is I think, today I mentioned the importance of reporting on, obviously on the situation in Libya, the human rights violations and the horrendous situation in which many migrants find themselves in, and how that could impact policy, right? When the voices really are joined, and journalists and civil society and activists, but also at the same time, how it's important to balance that with a wider discourse about, the more positive aspects of migration. So when we talk about protection, mixed movements, and certainly the humanitarian situation and humanitarian needs of groups, in specific situations, we also have to link this with the wider migration narrative, in which migration is not only about risks and it's not only about vulnerabilities, but it's about people's agency to overcome those when they are put in a position to do that as well by our policies as in obviously states primarily, and so I think that this should also be part in a way of this holistic approach to how how to address protection risks and vulnerabilities in mixed movements, balancing the narrative really, and particularly I'm referring to the balancing the narrative, on migration between Africa and Europe, but on migration more broadly when we talk about particularly irregular, undocumented migration. I think this also links to a point on partnership that we were talking about, sort of how do we join our voices across, international organizations, certainly when UNHCR and IOM come out on a joint statement on how Libya is not a safe port, that has more resonance than if just one of the organizations would be doing that alone. And that is the same for other messages, I think, and not only across international organizations, with different mandates, but more broadly between, international organizations, civil society, and people and actors that are involved in all of this. I think partnerships can really help us, because I think what comes out also of these discussions that we all agree on the on the principles and the main issues, but then who's on the listening side, who has to act on these recommendations, right? And so I think this aspect of partnership, cross-sectoral partnerships as well, is key in raising our voices and influencing the political will. And the third point is, I think it was mentioned as well, but also came up during the smuggling panel, is also raising the voices of the families, the families of missing migrants that we talked about during the panel, but also voices of migrants and voices of people, and I think that is something that we could all do more of, and there's certainly a need more of that in media, in our work, in programming, and policy advocacy more broadly. I hope that makes sense. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for those three main points, and in particular your point on reporting is something that we can definitely take into the outputs of this process here when we design them. I'd like to invite next Leander, followed by Jean-Pierre. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much. By way of the next steps, I will want to suggest that if it is at all possible, we consider a couple of special issues based on the thematic areas that have been covered. I think it would be a great shame to lose all this rich information that has been put out there. So if the panelists are encouraged to flesh out the initial write-ups by way of the policy notes, and then to compile that in a special issue, that might be another way of putting out the output so that other people are able to benefit from the rich discussions that have taken place. And I think the feedback that we have received will also allow us to be able to refine whatever we initially put out. And yeah, blogs is another way, but I think a special issue will have it will add a lot to the discourse, the migration discourse in the area of trafficking in West Africa and then North Africa as well. Thank you.
Thank you for being the second, let's say, to offer up an idea of a strategy for what's next. I think a special issue or volume based on the thematic areas we've covered to really just capture not only the key findings, but how they've all spoken to each other and refine based on the inputs is a really crucial point here. Thank you. Jean-Pierre and then Dalmar, thank you.
Thanks, Ayla. Yeah, I think my point, I very much agree with the idea of a special issue or something similar to raise awareness of the discussions that have taken place over the last 2 days, which have been really illuminating both for, I think, people working in the region, but also people who are working on migration issues, not directly within the region, but also benefit from finding out more about these discussions. I think my main point is goes back to something I said, I think yesterday or potentially Monday, around the issue of accountability. And this is something that came up with regards to private actors who don't rescue people. But I think it's something that we need to be thinking about more broadly in terms of the various actors that are involved and how they are held accountable to their own human rights obligations and human rights responsibilities, depending on the nature of that, of the particular actor. And that obviously includes states, so whether it's Libya, whether it's other, whether it's Libya, whether it's Malta, whether it's Italy, whether it's other countries. But it also includes other actors, including NGOs, private actors, international organizations, etc., and making sure that human rights considerations and human rights conditionalities are included in funding arrangements with those and are part of how we assess, and adherence to those human rights obligations is part of how we assess success of projects and programs in this space. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that feedback. Dalmar, may I invite you to unmute?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, Ayla?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would like to take this opportunity again to thank the UNHCR and MMC for giving me the opportunity to be part of this participation and very invigorating discussions on the protection challenges. What I would like to share is particularly some insights from a research I did on the role of city we can use in engaging with the protection challenges of the people on the move, which exemplifies actually promising practices from the Netherlands perspective. My research focused on the urban context and how policies at various levels construct the experiences of irregular migrants from mixed movement, and address the question of how cities and local support organizations help migrants deal with the harsh reality of the policy environment. Since from the national policy level, it does not provide any opportunity structure for them to regularize. So I examined the differences in city and the political atmosphere, and these differences were very important because they potentially impact the leeway that the local organization have to provide support for the irregular migrants and their lived experiences. And one of the best promising practices that I came across was one of the faith-based organization actually has initiated a SAFE project. In this SAFE project, what they call SAFE project focuses on protecting the irregular migrants and handling privileged information that has been provided regarding the irregular migrants in a more secure way without sharing with other organizations and local authorities. In this way, they are able to see what kind of resources is required and whether their situation may need any other outside involvement of other parties. The information provided by irregular migrants is also used in finding legal channels to help them legalize, or else to see in what other ways that they could be able to support them, but at the same time safeguarding their lives. So this was kind of very important. This action actually generated the informal and safe spaces at the city level. This faith-based organization in both cities, in Amsterdam and in Rotterdam, actually really provided some safe spaces and sanctuary spaces. And this has enabled to provide some stability and continuity for these irregular migrants. Another key dimension that I would like to mention is that there have been through the action, there have been about over 40 companies and organizations, both public and private, who are willing to employ the migrants, as well as 40 families, both Dutch and long-time immigrants who are willing to host the homeless migrants, irregular migrants. So this was a very positive aspect that I came across during my research. Another key dimension is the labor migrants and migrant workers. They usually provide for the necessary resources that they need. Amsterdam is quite really active, and they have the Amsterdam City Rights. It does advocacy, and they collaborate with all other organizations, including with the local authorities. So I would like to share that particular part, maybe when we talk about urban migration governance in dealing with protection challenges or local urban displacement of irregular migrants or refugees in that sense. The other thing, maybe I will take 1 minute is I will just go back to what I talked about, the smuggling. Maybe we could focus on the victim-focused victim-focused approach. That will be very necessary rather than looking from the perpetrator's side of focused approach where we look for the details. So that will be another area which will be very, very important. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Marie. Really appreciate it. I just want to raise 2 points that are that have been raised in the chat. One is related to the discussions around partnerships that we've been having, and not losing sight of universities and educational institutions as partners, not just in education delivery, but in all of these areas in which we have been discussing. The second point is something that was in our graphic on yesterday, which is about the value of expanding creative and responsible use of social media. So bringing in social media as an innovative tool for community relationships and also information exchange, of course, in a way that's safe. These were raised by panelists in the chat. So I realize that we've now come to the end of this session. So what I would very much like to ask, and if we can get the technology working, which we're doing behind the scenes now, is that I want to know if everyone here in the room can validate all of these key points that are raised. I mean, of course, what you see before you, the fantastic graphic that Emma has provided with, really are just signposts for the larger discussions that we've had. But nevertheless, we'd still very much like you to validate that these are some of the key points that reflect the discussions that we've had, and also that we as MMC, but also UNHCR, can begin exploring how we can turn this into a volume or a special issue. And so we're going to try and get that poll for you on the screen now. unless my team tells me that it's not possible, in which case I will simply ask you to raise your hand if you do validate it. Whilst they're figuring that out, I would like to thank everyone for this wrap-up session. I think it's been a really nice opportunity to take a step back and to take a break from all of the content that we've been sharing over these very rich and full days, and to spend some time reflecting on it and really to think about really what's stuck in our minds. And so this has been a really worthwhile space to have with each other in order to do that. Our next session, of course, is our final wrap-up, in which we shall aim to be brief. And here is our poll. So if while you're answering, if I could, Vincent, would you like to say a few words first, or would you like me to say a few words first? I defer to you.
Thank you. I try to put up my camera. 1 second. Yeah, hope it's working. Yes. Well, many thanks to all the panelists. I mean, I don't want to wrap up. I think you have done it very well, Ayla, with colleagues, and I really like that posters that was made with all the suggestions. I think we commit to follow up on the recommendation, but of course it's well beyond the capacity of UNHCR in many areas. So I think it will require a partnership. I think something I'd like to see also indeed with IOM and with others is how we can regroup some of those recommendations, and we'll involve MMC in that, how we can regroup them by theme and try to push it both at the regional, cross-regional, but also at the national level. I mean, sometimes we expect too much from progress at the regional level, and it might be too difficult because there is toxic political interference when we discuss protection of migrants or protection of refugees in mixed movement. And that toxic political interference can be within sub-region or across sub-region. So we need to find the safe space where we can have policy discussion with states. But I think as it was mentioned, it's important to recognize the role of other actors, civil society actors, and local actors who are, we've seen it during the COVID period, they are the first responder, or at least the first witness of the suffering of the people if they are not included in national response plans. So I think we need to make sure that those discussions involve the actors that are really present on the ground and who sees the problem, I think, pretty well the same way we see them and with very little capacity to act. So I think if there is one takeaway from that workshop, and there are many, that one is, I think, is an imperative for us to work differently with local actors on all those protection areas. But I don't want to recap, as I said, because that would be reductive of the rich debates that we had over the last 3 days. I'd like to thank you at MMC for the great work, you, Ayla, for the facilitation, all the interpreters, all the panelists, all the people who have helped us on the technical side, without forgetting my colleague Eddie, Rua, and Fergus, who were heavily involved in preparing this event. I think that's all what I would like to say at this stage, but a big thank to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I would also like to provide a special mention, if you could turn your cameras on, also to Fergus and Rua, who have really been working behind the scenes with our team, and to Jim and Rim, who you've all been in contact with in the lead up to this, that have really planned everything that you that you see here, as well as Imen that have worked together with Jose and Nahom on ensuring that they could participate in this workshop, also our colleague Anna Maria. So many thanks to them for making this happen. They have been working behind the scenes nonstop. So thank you. And once again, thank you for everyone. I also won't repeat the sentiments that Vincent just gave because they are my own. So we really hope that you follow up with us. We will follow up with you, and we can stay engaged following this this workshop. It seems like we have 100% validation, which is great to know from all of you in the room. And also something that my team is telling me is that we will have a survey, a link to a survey that will appear once this workshop is over, and it's only 10 questions, multiple choice. We would greatly appreciate if you could fill that out. So it will also help us move this forward. Thank you so much to everyone, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Cheers, Ayla.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayla.
Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, Ayla. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ayla. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye, folks. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ayla. Thank you, Rim.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Super, c'était bien. Ça serait bien si on arrive à avoir aussi les discussions. Je ne sais pas si le chat, on peut le récupérer. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Voilà. Parce que si on arrive à avoir les discussions, il y a eu beaucoup de commentaires à la fin et beaucoup d'idées. Et donc, ce serait bien si on arrive à avoir tout ce fruit de la fin.
Mm.